Hey y'all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, Episode 3. Really great interview today. I caught up with Joshua Sattin of Sattin Hill Farm, and Josh is a really bright new no-till grower who I've been following for a while. I wanted to get Josh on the podcast for a lot of different reasons. One, he's fairly new to market gardening, so he gives us some perspective there. In other words, if you're new or perhaps even wanting to transition to no-till, Josh offers some great insight. Josh is also very systems-oriented and talks a lot about the importance of having the right tool for the job. And one thing that really piqued my interest was that Josh is farming 1/10 of an acre with no immediate intention of expanding. For perspective, that's 19 50-foot beds and high-rotation crops. No, wait. I'm sorry. Let me rephrase that. That's a freaking backyard. That's what it is. That's it. And he's growing a lot of food on it. With that in mind, I wanted to get this up for Thanksgiving week because this is the week when an aspiring grower can sit down in front of mom and dad, her Aunt Becky, Uncle Jesse, cousin Vinny, look them in the eye and say, so, about that yard of yours. And with that, let's get to the interview. Joshua Sattin of Sattin Hill Farm. Joshua Sattin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Great. Well, maybe we could just start with having you tell us a little bit about your farm. Size, scale, kind of stuff you're growing and how you're selling it.
Sure. This is sort of the tail end of my first growing season. Kind of sort of an urban farm in the size, but I'm sort of in between a suburban and rural kind of area. I live on a 2-acre lot, mostly wooded, I'd say cultivated land is probably under 1/10 of an acre. I'm doing the 30-inch bed, biointensive market garden style for my veggies out in the field. I'm also doing pasture-raised layers. I was doing chickens for the last year, and I'm going to be transitioning over to ducks over this winter. Mainly at the beginning of the year, I was trying to sort of throw a wide net and grow a lot of different things to see what worked in my environment and what I liked growing. Towards the end of the year, I've been specializing more and more on lettuce and salad greens, and that's sort of what I'm growing outside, and then I'm also doing microgreens inside.
Nice. Are you going to go all winter?
Yeah, with the microgreens for sure. I'm not sure how much production I'm going to get in the field over the winter. Again, first season. I have a small hoop house. I'm hoping to push the season at least another month or so. I'm not really sure. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, I'll be cranking microgreens all winter.
Nice. So it being your first season, how did you decide on doing a no-till garden?
I started with last year. We got some chickens. Sort of like let's start this thing going on in our backyard. My wife it's always been sort of a gardener, but more like flowers and ornamental stuff. And we got chickens and sort of went down that rabbit hole with like getting all the crazy, funky looking chickens. Eventually, I wasn't very careful about where I was getting my birds from, and they all got sick, and I had to get rid of all of them. So I basically started over, but it was actually a blessing in disguise because I sort of did a lot of research and fell into like the permaculture world and sort of, got that bug and sort of went down that rabbit hole on the internet and reading books. And the no-till method just seemed like the most sense to me. It seemed like the most sustainable way to farm. I don't have a big land to farm right now. Most of my land is covered with trees. So it just sort of made sense to try to crank out the most production in the smallest amount of space with that sort of setup. Started building beds in the spring and sort of went from there. And I think, partly the chickens were sort of the gateway into the sort of regenerative, sustainable agriculture world for me. Started using a mobile coop with portable electric fencing and, rotating them around and building soil that way.
So who were those early inspirations in terms of, the kind of permaculture people that were inspiring you to do a no-till garden?
I think sort of the classic guys online, guys like Richard Perkins and Curtis Stone and J.M. Fortier and those kind of guys, and sort of just seeing the sort of production levels that they can get with the no-till system and sort of the abundance of that. Realizing that market gardening is very input intensive. I'm just trying to figure out other ways to keep it as sustainable as possible.
What were you doing before you got into farming then?
So my first career, I taught high school math for about 5 years, and and then became a professional brewer. I did that for 5 or 6 years. Left the brewing industry, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago, and sort of looking for something else to do. I really enjoy working for myself. The brewing industry is a really tough industry to be in, especially I think when you have a family and it becomes more of a job and less of a part of your life. And it's just, there's a lot of people in it and the money's bad. So it's not that farming's any better. But moving on from that, like I just wanted to do something more sustainable, something more connected to the community. I don't know. It seems to make sense for me. I really have loved it so far.
When you guys decided to start your gardens, how did you go about it? What sort of, did you break the ground? Did you just cover it? What was your sort of approach there?
So I did not, I didn't do either of those things. What the first beds that I built, so I have 50-foot beds. My first field block that I set up, I parked my chickens in there over last winter. I don't remember, 25 to 30 birds maybe. And I let them I put a perimeter around it with electric fence and just let them go at it for a long time. Chickens are unbelievable at tilling. Not a deep till, but the surface gets very well agitated. And obviously I'm getting tons of nitrogen from their manure. So after they sort of ate all the grass and really scratched it up, I started throwing wood chips in there. And so that got broken down over the course of, 3 months or 4 months over the winter. The good thing for me is I didn't have to rotate them, so it was less work for me, and they're constantly working the soil and creating compost and topsoil for me. So that was sort of how I started. Once I pulled them off in the spring, a ton of material. My soil here, I know people talk about heavy clay. I think my soil is clay. I think it's pretty much like you could make a clay pot out of it. It's like so thick and useless. So I brought in a bunch of material. I started with I brought in 50 topsoil compost blend that I brought in from a garden center and just laid that down and just started going from there. Yeah, in retrospect, I think it might have been good to till at the beginning and get some more structure into the ground and sort of work the soil a little bit to get some better drainage. But that's what I did. I don't know, looking back, it's always like, I wish I did something a little bit differently. But using the chickens, I think, helped a lot, just to disturb the ground a little bit.
So you just went ahead and built the beds out of that compost, and then you started immediately planting into that? Or was there a sort of, did you do any sort of tarping or anything in between?
No, I didn't because, as I said, like the chickens really like beat the crap out of the ground and like ate pretty much everything. And so when I layered a couple inches of that compost and topsoil on top, I just planted directly into that. It was pretty much weed free as much as it could be. So I didn't feel the need to tarp it. And I just went from there. I'm using wood chips in my walkways mainly because I'm on a slight slope, and when I'm adding more and more material, because I'm adding a lot of compost on the top, I need to sort of fill in between the beds. Otherwise, it kind of just washes away if it rains really hard.
Where are you getting those wood chips?
So I've gotten them from a few places. I refuse to pay for them. So I've gotten them from a couple of tree companies. I've also gotten them from one of the local municipalities, and they just bring me whatever they have.
Are you doing a lot of transplanting, or are you doing primarily seeding?
I'm doing both. My lettuces I'm transplanting. The fall's been tricky. We had 2 hurricanes within like 3 weeks of each other. So all the lettuce I'm transplanting and direct seeding. Mainly everything else. I mean, I'm trying to think of the other transplants I did, tomatoes and cucumbers, which I had in my hoop house during the summer. That was mainly it. I've transplanted some kale as well. Now I'm growing baby kale, so I'm just direct seeding that.
So how do you flip a bed? And you can use any example you want, or a few really.
Yeah, totally. So I guess the first thing after I've harvested, or if it was a field crop or whatever, I pull out the crop. I tend to just mainly just pull it out with my hands. It takes a little bit more time, but for me, I don't want to go through with like a hoe because I want to try to keep as much soil in the ground as possible. And I feel like when I do that and start raking it out, I'm just pulling soil out. So I just literally pull up as much of the plants as I can. Some of them are easier than others. Like if you've got lettuce, it's pretty easy to pull out lettuce. But if you're doing 9 or 10 rows of arugula or some baby green, it's a lot harder. So after I pull out as much of the crop as I can, I'll broad fork it. And then I take my flame weeder, which is crucial to me to keep the weeds down. I just have one of the cheap one torch flamethrowers that you can get at, a hardware store or whatever. I wish I had one of those fancy ones I could just roll down the whole bed. I just don't have one now. So I flame weed it and then put out any amendments that I want to do. If it's more compost, or it's I use a dried chicken manure. And after that, I have a tilther that I got from Johnny's. I run that over the bed, rake it smooth, and it's ready to go.
And then, so in terms of deciding what amendments to add, are you doing soil testing and that sort of thing?
I haven't yet. I think I know that I need to do it, and I think it's on my agenda for next spring. So it's been sort of a guess. It hasn't been perfect. Also, like my beds, in some of my other beds I added later. So there's sort of, my soil is a mixture of a lot of different inputs. So I don't know, I have to figure out like which beds I want to pull from to get a sample or do multiple samples or something like that. So I haven't been super scientific about it.
You said that you were kind of trialing a bunch of different stuff to see what crops worked and what crops didn't. Can you give us an idea of what crops you feel like didn't work?
Oh yeah, the list is long on that one for me. And I don't know if it was I think next year I could probably be a lot more successful about it, but I was like any new farmer, you're like, oh, yeah, I want to grow everything. And partly it's dictated by the fact that I was doing a veggie box delivery system to, local friends and their friends and stuff like that. Just, it sort of happened organically where they're like, hey, we want to buy your veggies. And I'm like, okay, cool. So I sort of felt the need to grow a lot of different stuff to put together, diverse boxes. And so I tried a lot of stuff. And, some of the stuff mainly was probably because I sucked as a farmer and I have a ton to learn. And a lot of the stuff over the summer, I would just be getting tons of insect pressure. And so I don't have insect netting at this point, something I'm going to be adding next year. And so brassica is basically no good for the summer. Like they germinate great, they come up, and then they just get eaten. So most of the summer I had a lot of trouble growing things like, radishes and turnips and, arugula and stuff like that. Like I could get it to germinate and come up and then like it would be looking great. And then I come out, it would just be full of holes. And so that's been a struggle. I was growing a bunch of squash, doing a lot of patty pan and some summer squash, and they were doing great. I was getting great production. Then squash beetles came in and I was battling them for a while, but then they just took everything out. So mainly for me, it's been insect pressure, and that's been something I'm gonna have to deal with. And part of it is I'd rather find the crops that do best without a ton of intervention. But if there's certain things I need to grow, I have to figure out how to do them.
So what is next year looking like then? How has that changed your sort of garden plan?
So I think in most businesses, farming or otherwise, like the more specialized you can get, the better you will be in terms of your quality and consistency, right? Like if you're growing a ton of stuff, and this is my opinion, or also as a former brewer, when you're brewing 15 different beers, like they're not going to be as good as if you only brewed like 4 beers, right? Because you can really focus and work on them all the time. And every crop is slightly different and has its own nuances, and you have to get it to work in your system and in your land and your environment. So next year, I'm going to be growing, I think I'm going to focus mainly on lettuce and salad greens. I'll probably do some tomatoes because they're awesome and everyone loves them. But mainly I'm just going to try to narrow down a little bit. The tricky part for me, I'm in central North Carolina, is that it's crazy hot and humid here in the summer. Pretty much half the year is hot and humid here. And so lettuce has been a struggle to grow, but I sort of caught the bug early with the lettuce, and I really like growing it. It just, I don't know, the first harvest, it was just like my mind was blown. It's like, I've never had lettuce like this. This is awesome. I know people want to eat this. I'll be still going with the microgreens if I can. I'm growing them under lights inside right now, but next year, if the volume goes up on that, I'd like to move them out into a greenhouse so that I'm not using electricity to grow plants. It seems kind of silly to me. I'm going to be continuing with the pasture raised layers. As I said, transitioning over to ducks. I really enjoy taking care of animals. We don't have nearly enough space to do anything besides poultry. We're not going to be doing meat birds at all, but I do enjoy the ducks, and rotating them around is really, I can see already after a year, like the soil is a completely different color than when I started. So it's going to be sort of a mixture of those. In terms of my sales outlets, the veggie boxes or the greens boxes that I'm doing, I'm hoping to continue. It's just been a really solid group of people that seem to enjoy it. And it's been sort of a whittling down over time because as I've become more specialized and having less diverse boxes, I lost a bunch of customers, but I've also gained some, and the people that are getting them really enjoy it. And so that almost makes it better because you have a sort of a loyal customer base that really wants to support you and what you're actually doing rather than hoping that the box will look different next week, something like that. Also trying to get into more restaurants. I've just sort of started that endeavor, selling to a couple of restaurants and hopefully going to be doing more of that and moving forwards. And I think just from talking to some chefs in the area, trying to figure out like, is my strategy going to be marketable in the Raleigh-Durham area? And so far, it seems like most of the chefs that are looking for local lettuce, like it's mostly grown hydroponically here. And so when they get soil-grown lettuce, they're kind of impressed by it and really like it. And also from what I've been heard so far is that duck eggs are hard to get to. It seems like everyone's got chickens. And
hey, y'all, just want to jump in real quick and say that if you go to the Sattin Hill Farm Instagram, there is a neat time lapse that Josh posted of his duck move, which is super fun. So go check that out. Anyway, back to Josh.
The retail price versus the wholesale price, to a restaurant is totally different. So for me to make it a little more profitable, I'm going over to ducks and working that angle too.
Yeah, we've had ducks in the past, and I've really liked raising them. They do their production is a little bit more consistent, so it's a little bit more spread out throughout the year as opposed to the chickens and yeah, that novelty is great at market and with restaurants.
No, right now our chicken production, our egg production is so down. Like I'm just like, okay, guys, I don't really have a lot of eggs for you this week, but as most of my ducks are they're not quite of laying age. Once they start getting in, I'm really hoping that they are more consistent. That's what I've heard. And plus, I think it's a cooler product. It's more niche, and I personally love duck eggs. They're like a whole different ball game for eating than chicken eggs. If no one's ever had them before, I highly recommend trying duck eggs.
Are you planning to, or how are you going to use them in the gardens? Like, are you going to rotate? You said you're rotating them, but are you rotating them through your garden plots, the chickens and ducks?
I am not. I would love to. I would love to maybe in the wintertime to park them on there and just let them crank and dump a bunch of manure on there. But at this point, I'm just rotating them sort of around the beds and just trying to build soil. If it's not just for growing better forage for them, which is sort of an awesome little cycle, it could be for just building soil for maybe future beds if I want to expand and that sort of thing. So no, I haven't had them since I had the chickens in, but to prep the beds, I haven't had them in the garden. And I think part of that is just disturbing it so much that I have to rebuild beds. And because I have that mixture of wood chips in the walkways and the beds being permanent beds, I think it would just make a mess if I had them in there. I know there'd be a ton of benefit to it, but I just can't do it right now.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense. Are you making any big changes for next year in terms of infrastructure?
I think it really depends on how the winter goes in terms of finances. I think, I get people ask me like, oh, are you going to add more beds? Or are you going to grow more? And I'm thinking, I just got to grow better first. Like I have tons of space to grow veggies. So I don't know, until I really max out the production on that, I don't really want to add too much more. I would love to cut down some trees. As I said, there's a bunch of land sort of that's open, but it's got trees, it's cleared out, but it's got trees, and that's sort of at the bottom of the hill in the space that we have. And I would love to cut down some trees. That's just a serious expense. The trees are just too tall for me to cut down. I would just cause a lot of destruction if I started cutting those trees down. And so infrastructure wise, I'm not really sure yet. It's a financial decision that we'll have to make when we get there. We sort of have to see how the winter goes. I don't I don't know what else I'd really need right now. If the duck eggs pick up, maybe it's more of an investment in some more ducks and some more structure for them. But at this point, like I have most of the tools that I need. I would love to get a couple more fancy tools. Like I would love a paper pot transplanter, and I don't have a quick greens harvester right now, stuff like that. But in terms of big infrastructure, I don't think we'd be adding anything in the spring.
You said you had the tilter. What are some other tools that you're kind of working with right now?
Yeah, so broad fork, the tilther, the flame weeder, which is not a fancy flame weeder. Besides that, I'm trying to think of other tools that I use all the time. A rake. It's awesome when someone asks you about your tools and like I don't have a tractor, I don't have a BCS, like it's all hand tools. Yeah, I think I'm trying to think if there's anything else like normal stuff, normal garden tools you have around your any sort of garden. But those are the main ones that I use regularly for prepping and flipping beds and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's funny. We're kind of the same way. We've pared down quite a bit in our tools. We still have a BCS with a flail mower and all that stuff, but as we continue to grow our sort of no-till production, our tools are sort of dropping by the wayside. I still feel like there's a lot of room for new tools in the sort of no-till model. But yeah, it's funny how few you really need to get it done. Is there anything you mentioned the paper pot transplanter? Is there anything that you wish existed or that you wish you could have beyond that? That's like the paper pot and the harvester, but is there anything like in your system that you're like, man, I could really use something that does this?
Yeah, I mean that's the big one right now. I mean, the paper pot would be unbelievable. Just like if you're, like anyone has transplanted like a bajillion lettuce heads in the ground, like your back starts to hurt pretty quickly. And as I'm getting older and I've had back problems, between different things, like especially brewing, that's the hardest thing for me. And I mean, at this point I can do a 50-foot bed in like just over an hour, but it's like, if I focus mainly on lettuce next year and maybe the year after, that would be a huge time saver and energy saver. Like if I could transplant a bed of lettuce in 5 or 10 minutes versus over an hour, like all of a sudden, like lettuce production becomes a lot more simple. But right now it's me by myself doing everything. So it's not really, I know we should always consider our labor, but when you're basically doing the work yourself, it's like, all right, I'll work a little bit more today, Other tools like the greens harvester, I would really like for doing baby greens. I think that would help me a lot with consistency of cutting and time, because that's another leaning over with a knife in your hand thing that it's not enjoyable. Like besides that, like, I would love a nursery for doing transplant growing and starts and get my microgreens in there too. I think something that's got a little bit better temperature regulation and I don't know, a little bit more, technology in it. My hoop house is just like as cheap as I could build it. It was, really simple. I do have manual roll up sides, but there's no electricity in it. There's no heating. So, stuff like that. But, as you said, like the tools are really simple. I would love one of those flame weeders that does the whole bed at once. But again, it's not like mine's not effective. It's just a time saver. That probably would cut a bunch of time off my bed flips, but it's one of those things. It's like, or I'll just work a little bit more today.
So how are you doing your transplants? You said you have a small little hoop house. Are you doing all your own transplants?
Yeah. So in terms of, I start everything from seed. I'm starting them inside in plugs in the trays. And then basically I have a couple of racks with fluorescent lights in them that I use for growing microgreens and starting transplants. After usually about 2.5 weeks, I move them. I have this, I don't even know what you call it, like a mini greenhouse. It's like a 4x8 thing with plastic over it that I have to just sort of harden off. So I move them out there for a while, and then I transplant them into the beds. Just by hand, I just pop out the plugs and go down the rows and pop them in.
What's your post-harvest system? Do you have a good little wash pack station?
Yeah, so as this is a real startup operation, I've converted most of my garage into sort of farming stuff. One thing I did invest and put the time and money into, and it wasn't a ton of money, but just sourcing things and building things, learning how to do it was a greens washing station. And I was very much like thinking ahead that I wanted to do a lot of lettuce and a lot of greens. So I have a greens bubbler, converted washing machine for spinning, and then a drying screen with overhead fans, box fans for drying. And that has been, I could not imagine doing greens without it. Like I don't know how, I couldn't even imagine it. I don't know like how many pounds I could push through that in a day. But right now it's got way more capacity than what I need.
Yeah, the reason I asked is because you're in your first year, and I was curious, like, in our first year, we didn't focus enough on things like the wash pack station, so it was a mess. And that was one thing that we really, really knew we had to change, was upping our wash pack station. So it's cool that you were already ahead of the game on that one.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I just as I'm very operation production based. That's like how I focus and what I thrive on. Coming from the production world in the brewery, it's very much like everything's got to be in line. You got to have the right tools in the right places. Things got to be really clean and tidy. Production planning is super important, and that's something that I love doing. And so for me, I was just like, before I even started harvesting, I'm like, I got to have a system for this. Otherwise, it's just going to be a disaster. And again, it wasn't a ton of money. It was just like, okay, I have to spend the time to put this together. I mean, all of that was probably a couple $100. I mean, it wasn't a huge expense. It was just like, okay, where am I going to set this up? I have to learn how to build it. But yeah, having that has been huge. Like when I harvest lettuce, and I can, I talked to some other farmers like, oh, I don't want to touch lettuce because I don't want to deal with, the post-harvest stuff. And I'm like, you got to have the right tools for the right job. And it's been awesome.
Yeah, nice. So what's your plan? You said you wanted to do more lettuce next year. Like how are you going to go about doing more summer lettuce?
So, following most of the leads of people I can find that, most people are growing Salanova, and I personally have not had a ton of luck with it. And mainly it was probably because I started with it and I was just like, all right, I'm going to grow lettuce. I'm just going to put stuff in the ground. It should grow, right? At the beginning of the year. And then that sort of was like, okay, I really had to learn how to do all this. And partly I've realized is like one of the hardest things that I've had to overcome was the germinating and growing the transplants. I think, I don't know, I don't hear a lot of people talking about it, but for me, it was like, okay, I need to keep them really cool. Otherwise they won't germinate. So I air condition my garage, and that's where they germinate. So I can germinate them all summer. And then just getting a really strong transplant going to the ground helps a lot. So the summertime production is obviously tricky. It's over 90 degrees and humid pretty much, I don't know, at least 5 months out of the year here. So there's a couple of varieties I've been playing with. For example, Mir and Cherokee have been awesome. They were able to grow in the summer pretty well here. And I'm probably going to be doing more of that next year. Again, you're in the summertime, you're not looking for multiple cuts. It'll probably bolt pretty quickly. You got to make sure you get your harvest done at the right time. But I think playing with varieties helps a lot, and I'd like to try some shade cloth next year too. Maybe to do some other stuff if it's not lettuce, and sort of working with nature here and trying to figure out like what's going to work with the least amount of interference, I guess.
Did you say? I know I'm jumping around a little bit here, but did you say that you had a cooler too?
No, I don't have a cooler right now. I have an extra refrigerator I've been using, just a regular domestic refrigerator. And that is something that's I know is going to have to happen. It's just at this point, it's been working for me just because I harvest and then it goes out the next morning. And the volume's been at the point where I'm just trying to make it work. That's another, you asked me before about infrastructure, and that's probably something I need to do in the near future. Maybe it's a good winter project for me when I have a little bit of time. Farmers in general, like, will try to get creative with solutions. Like maybe I usually harvest on Thursdays and deliver on Fridays. But maybe my restaurant deliveries, I do them on Tuesdays or something. And so my fridge is not being used, or, I always feel like there's a workaround, and you try to make things work. But a cooler would be huge. In terms of the salad and lettuce in the summer, I harvest as early as I can get out there. Once I get the kids out of the house and they get on the bus to go to school, I'll head out there and harvest as soon as I can in the morning. I put it right into the water bath, into my bubbler, so it has no time really to just like sit out in the heat. And doing that has been huge. So I have, I'm on well water, and it's super cold even in the summer. So I get the lettuce like right in the cold water. I bubble it, I spin it, and I dry it, and it goes in the fridge. And so for me, it's like the shelf life's been great. And it's been, in the summertime, you got to be extra careful with harvesting lettuce. If you go out there in the afternoon, you're not going to get a good product that way.
I know of farmers. We haven't done this personally, but that just use multiple refrigerators.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of thinking more along that lines. Like, it's just also in terms of time, like for me to like build a walk-in, and because I know that's probably the cheapest way to do it, get a AC and a cool bot and do that sort of thing. And then it's also a lot more of a fixed asset. Like I can't really move it around, and refrigerators, you can move them around. I'm a big fan of like mobility, and like, what's good now may not be good next year. And so the option to move infrastructure around is awesome. I think because all my chicken coop and my duck house, like everything's mobile. I love it. The one thing I wish was that my hoop house was mobile. I wish I could have moved that. That's really fixed in the ground, and I can't move that. So yeah, the idea of maybe a couple of, cheap refrigerators makes sense, both financially and, sort of, mobility wise.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I really like that idea of emphasizing some amount of mobility. I especially think that's important in the first few years, because if you build something big and you realize like, oh, that spot is really, if you build a big hoop house or something, you realize that spot's really wet, or you realize it's just not an optimal spot for whatever reason. It's kind of stuck there, or you have to take the whole thing down and move it. And that's like buying another one.
Yeah, I think with everything I've sort of done so far, you do your research, you think through it, you talk about it, you're like, all right, this is what I want to do for this situation. And then you're like, you start using it for a while, and you're like, I don't like this. And then you're kind of stuck there. So for me, I like to have that option of like moving things around and changing things up, because you always, once you get into it, you sort of figure out better ways of doing things.
When we started out, we definitely did not, my wife and I, we definitely did not think those kind of things through. And it's fun for me to talk to people who come from some industry that has like a production model, because neither my wife or I did. So it's funny, we were never able to apply that to our farming. We both were like artists, so that's what we applied to our farming. So it's funny how different that shaped your farm, like how what you grew up doing, or what you were trained in doing, or what you excel at really, really reflects in your farm.
Yeah, I mean, I think as anyone, as they get older, you try to pull from all of your life experiences. I've had a small business before, so I have some of that business sense. The production, that's one of the reasons why going into farming made a lot of sense for me, is because that production mindset is so strong. And that's something, maybe looking back, I should have just done a career in like production analysis or whatever, or, some sort of industrial engineering or something like that. But, for me, it's like, yeah, that part is not a struggle for me. I love it. It's like a challenge to figure that stuff out. And, when it works out, you're so happy. So, I love it. And I think that's one of the best things about farming. People come into it from all different aspects and bring all different things. And, talking with other people, or interacting or seeing what other people are doing, you're like, oh, I didn't even think about that. And you can sort of pull that all together and make it work. But as like, maybe I struggle with some of the, natural stuff in farming, like I thrive in production, or, thinking through systems and things like that.
What's one area you would really like to improve upon for yourself?
Right now, it's marketing and sales, without a doubt. It's one of those things, when you're a small business owner, you got to wear all the hats. And so I tend to focus on production and efficiencies, and then I'm like, wait a minute, I got to go get some sales. So I think that's part of it for sure. That's, if you're not selling anything, you're not making any money. And so you get in that rut where you're like, well, if I don't have anything, I can't sell anything, but I got to sell, so you only have so much time in the day or in the week. And that's something that, I need to work on, trying to be as active as I can be on Instagram. That's been sort of my main marketing. But I need to get out there and talk to more chefs and get in front of more people.
Where do you go, or where would you recommend going for information on the sort of growing that you do? Like, what are your resources? What are your go-to resources?
Um, YouTube mostly. I as a former teacher, like it just like amazes me that there's so many people out there providing content that teaches. You can learn how to do anything online. If it's fixing your washing machine or learning how to train your dog or whatever, there's tons of people out there putting content out there, like yourself, Jesse, and that has been awesome for me.
Hey, y'all, gonna interrupt for one more second from editing land because I have an announcement. We have dropped the paywall on the Patreon Facebook group, so there is now officially a No-Till Market Garden Success group on Facebook. Of course, there is also still a Patreon group, which affords me to be able to do this podcast and the videos, so I do hope you will consider joining that. A couple bucks a month, maybe 5, 10, whatever you can afford. That keeps these things going. But we also wanted to open up that group to build this movement, so please go, join, it's free. Also, if you don't do Facebook, well, we're working on something for that too. Anyway, back to Josh.
But you always get into a situation that's like super focused and technical, and at that point, it's like I don't know, I got to try a couple things or see if I can find this information. There's a lot of great books out there as well from some of the guys that I mentioned before. But that's been sort of my approach to getting information is just using the internet.
It is an extraordinary thing. I was having this conversation with Alex Eakins, who's going to be on the podcast right before this one airs, about how new this style of farming is and how much potential there is for change. But also there's this, for it to be developed, because it really is fairly new. But one of the things that really makes it interesting is that it's not like it used to be. Like everything kind of used to be no-till before there was steel and that sort of thing. Now, what's really changed is that we have the internet, we have steel, we have engineers and scientists and microbiologists and all these people that can really say, no, this is how all of this works. So it's sort of this like post-industrialization, no-till farming that, like post-green movement, post all these other things. So now we're using all those resources to kind of build an entirely new form of agriculture. It's kind of an interesting moment to be a farmer.
Totally. I agree completely. And when I talk to people about the methods I'm using, I say, well, this is actually really old school. Like a lot of this stuff, it's like, I'm not using a tractor. I'm not tilling. I'm not just going through and rototilling everything and then replanting and then spraying with whatever. It's like, yeah, this is almost how farming was a long time ago in some ways. It's just now I feel like it's more researched and more technical, but it's also fairly simple at its core. Things like, for example, I don't get a lot of weeds, and I don't know. I started with like pretty clean soil that I added, but I flame weed in between my turns, but like I really don't weed that much. And people are always like, "Oh, you spend so much time weeding." It's like, no, I really don't. And if you go on my Instagram, you can see a lot of the pictures of my farm, and I try to keep it as clean as possible. And not only because I like it clean because I like working in that environment, but it's healthier for the plants. When people see it, it shows you that you're very serious about what you're doing. But yeah, the sort of going back and now like, oh, we're actually farming how maybe sort of we were a long time ago. It makes more sense. And for me, that sort of sold me on it, besides all the benefits of like, the biointensive where you sort of plant a bunch of stuff close together and then it canopies and creates, cover for the less sunlight for the weeds underneath and stuff like that. But like the environmental aspect is really what sold me on it. I mean, the fact that we're building soil, we're not turning over, releasing carbon dioxide and all that. And, I'm not using gasoline to to do stuff on my farm. I'm not even using petroleum-based products for fertilizers and pesticides and stuff like that. It's just like, oh, this makes sense to me. It seems like, look, you can get a huge amount of yield out of something without using a ton of technology, which to me was just like, it sold me like pretty quickly.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I feel like, reducing the amount of stuff that doesn't actually lead you to making any money, like weeding and general cultivation or whatever, like all the muda, all the waste. I feel like in some ways no-till does that, at least this kind of no-till does that automatically. And that's kind of a neat twist to it.
Yeah, I think everyone gets into whatever situation they're in for whatever reason, but yeah, that totally sold me too. And as I started doing it over the course of the season, I'm thinking, wow, this really does work. Like this really, like I really don't weed very much, like especially because I'm doing a lot of quick growing crops where, by the time there's even a little bit of weed pressure, the crops are coming out and I'm turning over the bed again. So that's also part of it too. But yeah, I mean, my inputs are pretty simple. Like my compost, the last batch of compost I got from a company that uses like all the food waste from NC State. So it's all broken down food, local food. So I feel good about that too. Like that's not going in the landfill. And the wood chips I'm getting, like if you can make a connection with a couple of tree companies in your area, like they actually pay to drop that off at the dump. They have to pay. So like for them to like bring it to your house, it's free and they don't have to pay. So to me, that I feel good about that as well. And so try to like minimize your inputs and your impact is really important to me.
Nice. Well, with that, man, I may just ask you a few rapid fire questions and then we'll wrap it up.
Cool.
So, who's your favorite farmer right now?
Richard Perkins. I think he just, I don't know, from everything I've seen, that he's just so open about sharing and he's sort of got the whole package. He's doing a little bit of everything. And to me, I would love to strive to have a system where I'm incorporating more things and try to close the loop a little bit more. If I had to pick one, it would be him for sure.
What's your favorite farming book?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I don't know. I don't have one. I think I have a couple. I'll give you a couple. I mean, of the guys I mentioned before, I've read their books too. So JM's book, and Curtis Stone's book and Richard Perkins. Those three guys have sort of been my main influences. I don't think I pick sort of one over the others. I think they're all important in different ways.
Nice. And what would you say to somebody who's getting into no-till farming or wants to get into farming and who's maybe nervous about going no-till?
Go visit some farms that are doing it. You got to think about like, what your goals are, like for me, I focus on, I say like, I want natural systems as much as possible. You have to be realistic about everything, but when you have your sort of core beliefs and you're like, all right, I want to focus on, natural, sustainable, regenerative farming, like, to me, that's the only thing that makes sense. If they're nervous about it, do your research, like see what you like doing. Like if you have a small space, like you want an urban farm or a suburban farm, like you can't beat the production. I mean, the fact that we're intensively growing these crops, like you get so much more out of a small area. Now, and it depends on what you want to grow. Like if you have a lot of acreage and you want to grow stuff that is more conducive to tractor farming, then that's what you're going to do. And and if you want to do that kind of farming, then go for it. But I think it depends on your context completely. I mean, if you have like for me, I don't have a ton of land to work with, and I'm trying to get as much output as possible. So to me, it just makes the most sense. But it really has to do with your context, what kind of farming, what kind of products you want to produce, that sort of thing.
Nice. Well, Josh, we really appreciate your time, man.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm glad to be involved.
All right, you all, if you enjoyed that interview, make sure to follow Josh on Instagram. Also, make sure to subscribe to this podcast and consider signing up for the Patreon page. That helps me keep going. That helps put up these podcasts. That helps do the videos. And it helps keep me sane. Anyway, all relevant links will be in the show notes. Lastly, your no-till fact of the day is that mycelium is so involved in the regular processes of some plants that if you removed all of the plant tissue, you would be left with a small sort of ghost statue of the plant made entirely of mycelium. Yeah, pretty cool. Anyway, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye.